53 million American households can't put solar panels on a roof they don't own, and until recently, that meant solar simply wasn't an option for them at all. Then a genuinely small idea started spreading out of Germany, where roughly 800,000 households have already mounted a panel or two directly onto a balcony railing. Japan's own Renewable Energy Institute has been publicly tracking the same idea for exactly the reason you'd expect. A country packed with apartment towers, where owning your own roof is the exception rather than the rule. Today we're building a version of that idea sized specifically to do one small, meaningful job. Keep your internet router and a set of lights running on a balcony for around $285, without touching your building's electrical system at all. That specificity is deliberate. This isn't a scaled-down version of a whole apartment solar system. It's a correctly sized answer to one narrow, genuinely common question. How do I keep my internet connection alive when the power goes out, without waiting on a landlord, a permit, or a grid tie approval that might take months to arrive? Before we continue, let me mention one thing. Many of the Japanese methods I share in these videos have been collected into a practical guide over at the Japanese Home Manual. If you'd like to explore them in more detail, you'll find it there. That's all. Now, let's get back to today's method. I want to draw a clear line before we go any further, because there are actually two different things people mean when they say balcony solar, and mixing them up is where a lot of confusion and some real legal risk creeps in. The version making headlines lately is grid-tied plug-in solar, a panel paired with a small device called a microinverter that plugs directly into a wall outlet and feeds power straight into your home circuit, offsetting what the grid would otherwise supply. It's a genuinely exciting technology, and new state laws are actively making it legal in more places. But as of right now, its legality varies significantly by state. It requires a UL 3700 certified microinverter, a safety standard the industry is still catching up to. And in a lot of places, it still needs sign-off from your landlord or utility. That's not the build we're doing today, and I don't want to hand you a project that might put you sideways with your lease or your local code. What we're building instead is the other kind of balcony solar, a fully standalone system that never touches your home's wiring at all. The panel charges a battery, and the battery powers your router and lights directly through their own dedicated cables. Nothing plugs into your wall, nothing connects to your building's circuit, and nothing requires anyone's permission but your own. It's a smaller ambition than offsetting your whole electric bill, but it comes with a real advantage. It's legal everywhere, requires no permit, no electrician, and no landlord conversation. Because from your building's perspective, it simply doesn't exist as an electrical system at all. It's a separate, self-contained device sitting on your balcony, no different than a solar-powered garden light, just scaled up. Here's why a router and a set of lights specifically make sense as the target for a build this size, rather than trying to stretch it towards something bigger. A typical home router draws somewhere in the range of 5 to 20 watts continuously, depending on the model and whether it's a combined router modem unit or a larger mesh system. A real meaningful range, which is exactly why checking your own router's power label matters before you finalize a build like this. Run continuously, 24 hours a day. That lands most routers somewhere around 150 to 350 watt-hours of consumption per day. Add a modest LED lighting setup, a string of lights or a couple of fixtures used for a few hours each evening, and you're looking at another 20 to 60 watt-hours on top of that. Altogether, a realistic daily target for this build sits somewhere around 300 to 400 watt-hours, which is a genuinely small, achievable number for a compact solar and battery setup, and it's dramatically smaller than trying to power anything with a real heating element, motor, or compressor. It's also worth noting that a mesh Wi-Fi system with multiple satellite nodes will draw more than a single standalone router, sometimes considerably more. So if your home uses a multi-node mesh setup, it's worth measuring or looking up the combined draw of every unit you actually want to keep powered, not just the primary router. That's the whole premise of today's build, and it's worth stating plainly before we get into parts and pricing. This system keeps your internet connection alive, and a few lights on through a power outage, or simply reduces what you're pulling from the grid every single day if you're running it as a permanent fixture rather than an emergency backup. It will not run your air conditioner, your TV, or your kitchen appliances. And if a video promises a balcony panel this size can do that, it's either quietly counting on grid-tied credit accumulation over months rather than real-time power, or it's simply not being honest with you about the math. Over the rest of this video, we're going to build the actual system, the panel, the battery, the wiring, and the specific detail that trips up almost everyone attempting a build like this. Matching your router's exact voltage requirement rather than assuming any 12-volt output will work. By the end, you'll have a complete, safe, fully standalone system that keeps the one thing most people actually panic about losing during an outage: their internet connection, running independently of whatever the grid is doing. There's a reason this specific target, router and lights, not a whole apartment, connects back to the same small-scale thinking that's run through most of the Japanese-influenced builds on this channel. After the extended blackouts following the 2011 earthquake, the shift in how a lot of Japanese households thought about backup power wasn't "how do I replace everything I lost?" It was, what's the smallest, most specific thing that actually matters, and how do I protect just that? For a lot of modern households, especially ones working from home or relying on a phone for everything from banking to checking on family during an emergency, a working internet connection is exactly that kind of specific, high-value target. Small enough to protect cheaply, important enough that losing it during an outage causes real, immediate stress. It's also worth being upfront about who this build is genuinely for, since a balcony is a specific kind of space with specific constraints. This works well for apartment dwellers, renters, and anyone without roof access who still wants a real, working solar setup rather than waiting on a landlord or a utility program. It requires a balcony or similar outdoor space that gets real, direct sun for a meaningful part of the day. A north-facing balcony, buried in permanent shade from a taller building next door, isn't going to produce enough to make this worthwhile, and it's worth watching your own balcony's actual sun exposure for a few days before buying anything, rather than assuming. A simple way to check without any equipment: note the hours your balcony gets direct, unobstructed sun over a few representative days, and if that number is consistently under 2 or 3 hours, treat the production estimates in Part 2 as optimistic for your specific space and size up the panel or scale back your expectations for the lighting portion of the build accordingly. Let's build it. The build has 5 components, and unlike a lot of solar projects, the trickiest part isn't the wiring. It's making sure your router actually gets the exact voltage it expects, which we'll walk through carefully rather than glossing over. First, the panel. For a balcony mount, we're using a 100-watt monocrystalline panel, rigid rather than the flexible foldable kind, since a rigid panel handles railing mounts and wind load far better over the long term. These typically run $85 to $110. Monocrystalline is worth the small premium here specifically because balconies often get partial or angled sun rather than perfect all-day exposure, and monocrystalline cells perform meaningfully better than polycrystalline in less than ideal light conditions. If your balcony is deep or partially covered by the one above it, a slightly larger 150-watt panel is worth the extra $15 to $20, since a shaded balcony loses far more of its theoretical output than a fully exposed one, and it's cheaper to size up the panel now than to discover months later that your router keeps browning out on cloudy afternoons. Second, railing mounting hardware. A set of adjustable balcony rail brackets, designed to clamp a rigid panel to a standard railing without drilling into anything, runs $20 to $30. This is the detail that makes the whole project renter-friendly. No holes in the balcony, no modification to the building at all, and the entire setup can be unclamped and taken with you if you move. Angle the panel toward the strongest, most direct sun exposure your specific balcony gets through the day, adjusting the bracket's tilt if it allows for it. Third, the charge controller, sitting between the panel and the battery to prevent overcharging. The same role it plays in every solar build on this channel. A basic PWM controller sized for a system this small runs $15 to $20. And it's not a place to cut corners. An unregulated panel connection will overcharge and shorten your battery's life significantly faster than the small savings from skipping the controller would ever be worth. A controller with a basic LED status display, rather than a completely blind unit, is worth the extra couple of dollars too. Being able to glance at a light and know whether the battery is charging, full, or low saves you from having to pull out a multimeter every time you want a quick status check. Fourth, the battery. Since we're targeting roughly 300 to 400 watt-hours of daily consumption and want at least a full day of buffer for cloudy stretches, a 12-volt, 30 to 40 amp-hour lithium iron phosphate battery is the right size, providing 360 to 480 watt-hours of usable capacity. LiFePO4 batteries in this range typically run $90 to $130, and as with every other build on this channel, the premium over cheaper lead-acid alternatives is worth it. This battery will be cycling daily if you're running the system as a permanent fixture rather than pure emergency backup, and LiFePO4 handles that kind of repeated deep cycling far better and for far longer. Fifth, and this is the detail that actually determines whether this project works or quietly fails the first time you plug your router in, matching your specific router's voltage. Nearly every router runs on DC power supplied by its wall adapter, but the exact voltage varies significantly by brand and model. Some run on 5 volts, some on 9, many run on 12, and some larger mesh systems or combination router modems run on 19 volts or higher. Before buying anything else, unplug your router's power adapter and read the label directly on the brick. It will state the exact output voltage and current, usually printed in small text as something like output 12 volts, 1.5 amp. That number is not optional information. It's the single most important spec in this entire build, because feeding your router the wrong voltage can damage it permanently within seconds. Once you know your router's exact voltage requirement, you have two paths. If it happens to run on 12 volts, which is a common voltage for standalone routers, you can often power it directly from the battery through the controller's load terminals, provided the current draw is within what your controller's load output can handle. Check your controller's spec sheet for its maximum load current, typically printed clearly on the unit itself. If your router runs on a different voltage, 5, 9, or 19 volts being common alternatives, you'll need a small DC-DC buck or boost converter, sized specifically to step the battery's 12-volt output up or down to match your router's exact requirement. These converters typically cost $10 to $15 and are sold specifically for this kind of voltage matching application. Look for one rated for adjustable output voltage and confirm it's set to your router's exact number, checked with a multimeter if you have one, before connecting your actual router. For lighting, the sixth and final component, a simple 12-volt USB-powered LED strip, or a couple of small 12-volt fixtures round out the build for roughly $15 to $20, running directly off the battery's output alongside the router, either through a second load terminal if your controller has one, or through a simple 12-volt splitter. Add it up, a 100-watt panel around $95, mounting brackets around $25, a PWM controller around $18, a 35 Ah LiFePO4 battery around $110, A voltage converter, if your router needs one, around $12, and LED lighting around $18, along with basic wiring, connectors, and fuses running another $15 to $20. That lands right around $285 to $295, depending on whether your specific router needs a converter. The honest range behind today's number, built from real components rather than a rounded-down marketing figure. Wiring it together follows the same safe sequence as every other solar build on this channel. Panel to controller first, matching polarity exactly, then controller to battery, then your router, through a voltage converter if needed, and lights connected to the controller's load output, or the battery directly through their own properly sized fuses. Every connection in this circuit needs an appropriately rated fuse placed close to the source it's protecting, and wire size to the actual current involved. For a system this small, pulling well under 10 amps on most connections, 16 to 14 gauge wire is generally sufficient, though it's worth checking your specific component's current draw against a wire gauge chart rather than assuming. One balcony-specific safety note worth taking seriously. Everything in this build needs to be genuinely weatherproof and secured against wind, since a balcony installation faces more exposure than a typical rooftop or ground-mounted system tucked against a house. Use outdoor-rated cable and connectors. Route wiring so it isn't a trip hazard or dangling where wind can catch it, and check your mounting hardware's tightness periodically. A panel that comes loose in a storm is both a safety hazard to anyone below and an expensive mistake for you. If your building has any rules about what can be attached to a balcony railing, even temporarily, it's worth a quick check of your lease or a message to your landlord before installation. Clamp-on brackets that don't require drilling are almost always fine, but it costs nothing to confirm that in writing rather than assume it, and it avoids an awkward conversation later. In the final part, we'll cover exactly how much runway this system realistically provides, how to verify it's actually keeping up with your router's real consumption, and where the honest limits sit if you're tempted to add more devices to what this build was actually sized for. Let's talk about what this system actually delivers day to day, because a correctly sized build still deserves an honest verification rather than blind trust that the math worked out. On a normal sunny day, a 100-watt panel getting 3 to 4 hours of strong, direct sun produces somewhere around 250 to 350 watt-hours, comfortably covering a router plus lights load in the 300 to 400 watt-hour range, with the battery's built-in buffer smoothing over the difference on slightly weaker days. The real test is a full week of normal use. Check your controller's display or a simple inline battery monitor once a day, ideally at the same time each evening, and confirm the battery is recovering to a healthy charge level rather than trending downward day after day. If you're consistently ending each day with less charge than you started, even on days with decent sun, that points to one of 3 likely causes. Your specific router draws more than the estimate we used in Part 1, your balcony's sun exposure is weaker than assumed, or a wiring or mounting issue is quietly reducing your panel's real output below its rating. A second, simple check worth doing in the first week. Verify your router is actually receiving the correct voltage once everything's wired up, using a basic multimeter if you have access to one, or by simply confirming the router powers on normally and stays stable rather than rebooting intermittently, which is often the first visible sign of a voltage mismatch. Catching a wiring or voltage issue in the first few days, while you can still troubleshoot or return a component, is far better than discovering it 3 weeks in when your router's been quietly running on the wrong voltage the whole time. Now, realistic expectations, stated plainly the way we do on every build on this channel. On a normal day with decent sun, this system keeps a standard router and a modest lighting setup running indefinitely, with the panel fully replacing what the battery gave up overnight. Through a single cloudy or rainy day, The battery buffer we built in carries the load without much help from the panel, and the system recovers once the sun returns. Where this system reaches its real limit is a multi-day stretch of heavy cloud cover. 3 or 4 gray days in a row will draw the battery down further than a single overcast day would. And depending on how deep that draw goes, your controller's low-voltage disconnect may cut power to protect the battery before the sun comes back. That's the system correctly protecting itself. Not a failure, but it's worth knowing about in advance if you live somewhere that regularly gets extended stretches without meaningful sun, particularly through winter. It's worth being honest, too, about the temptation that comes with any working solar setup. Wanting to add just one more device. A phone charger draws very little and usually fits comfortably within this system's remaining headroom on a normal day. A small fan or a second string of lights might fit, depending on your specific margins. But it's worth checking the math from part 2 again, rather than just plugging something in and hoping. What doesn't fit, no matter how you resize the panel within a budget like this one, is anything with a genuine heating element, a motor drawing serious current, or a device that needs to run on standard 120-volt AC power rather than the native 12-volt DC this build produces. A laptop charger. Most phone chargers and small electronics generally need their own separate small inverter or a USB adapter matched to their actual voltage, which is a reasonable add-on but should be sized and added deliberately, not squeezed in, without checking whether the battery and panel can actually support it. There's a broader idea worth closing on, the same one that's run through every build on this channel. A balcony panel this size was never going to replace your electric bill, and pretending otherwise would be exactly the kind of dishonesty this channel doesn't do. What it genuinely does is protect one specific, valuable thing: your connection to the outside world during an outage, or a small, permanent reduction in what you're drawing from the grid every single day, for a fraction of the cost and complexity of a full grid-tied system, and without needing anyone's permission but your own to install it. That's not a compromised version of real solar. It's a correctly scoped answer to a real, specific problem millions of apartment dwellers actually have, built the same honest way every project on this channel gets built. Real components, real prices, and a clear line drawn around exactly what the money buys. Before you go, tell me in the comments what your router's actual power label says. The voltage might surprise you, and whether your balcony gets enough sun to make a build like this worthwhile. If you've already got a version of this running, share what's actually powering it, and how it's held up through a real outage. I read every comment, and those real numbers from real balconies are usually exactly what shapes the next build on this channel. One last honest note before you go shopping for parts. It's tempting, once you understand how this build works, to want to immediately push it further. A bigger panel, a second battery, an inverter to run a few more household devices. There's nothing wrong with eventually building that bigger version, if it's genuinely what you need. But it's worth living with this smaller, correctly scoped system first, and watching how it actually performs through a real week of normal use, before deciding what comes next. A router and a set of lights, kept reliably running for around $285, without touching your building's wiring or waiting on anyone's approval, is already a meaningful win on its own. Let it prove itself before you decide it needs to be bigger. And if you're one of the growing number of renters watching new state laws slowly legalize the grid-tied version of balcony solar in your area, know that the two approaches aren't in competition with each other. The standalone system we built today solves a narrower problem, keeping specific devices running independently, while grid-tied plug-in solar, once it's legally available and properly certified where you live, solves the broader problem of offsetting your overall electric bill. There's a reasonable case for eventually running both. This standalone system as dedicated, guaranteed backup for what matters most, and a certified grid-tied system, once your state allows it, for the bigger, ongoing savings. Neither replaces the other, and neither needs to be built before you're genuinely ready for it.